Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Erin McKinley. I am helping out the SCNG group today with our Zoom conversation, and we're going to be starting in the next minute or two, but I just wanted to go over some housekeeping notes with everyone. We are going to be taking some questions. If anyone would like to ask some questions, go ahead and use that Q&A button right on the bottom portion of your Zoom link. And if you have any other comments, we'd love to hear from you. Please give us a shout out in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as well. And also know that everyone here is going to be on mute. We want to make sure that our panelists and our guests have the opportunity to kind of talk freely. So we will be starting, like I said, in about 1 minute or so. We want to go ahead and allow some more subscribers to join. So please just hold on for 1 minute and we will start. All right, for those who are just joining, again, my name is Erin McKinley. I am helping out for our Zoom webinar today. We are going to get started here. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions for any of our authors, please go ahead and use the Q&A button. If you have any other comments, go ahead and use the chat feature. We'd love to hear from you. I'm here and I'm so excited and pleased to introduce to you SCNG's editors, Samantha Dunn. She's an award-winning journalist and has written several books and currently serves as the executive editor at the Southern California News Group. Sam, it's all yours.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you and welcome to all of our valued subscribers and everybody else who's joined us tonight for this salon-style conversation with writers and performers. And we're going to be talking about books and ideas, which I guarantee will offer diverse opinions and perspectives. Just want to say we value your support as subscribers and readers, and we couldn't do anything without you, so thanks. Like Erin said, at the Southern California News Group, I'm an editor for special publications, like the one that inspired tonight, which was Lit Up. Here's a show and tell. Lit Up, your guide to books, writers, and the literary life of SoCal. That came out at the end of May. And it's a topic near and dear to my heart, again, as Erin said, because I've authored a few books myself and been a longtime literary citizen of the local scene. And that is where I became friends with our host for this evening, for this whole series, actually, who I'm pleased to introduce to you now, the well-known NPR commentator, performer, contributor at The Atlantic, author of 6 books today, as of today, which includes her newest one, The Mad Woman and the Roomba. Please meet Sandra Tsing.
Coming to you from my cluttered house in Pasadena. Hello. Hello, Sam.
Hello. Sandra, as you know, we did Lit Up because we wanted to create a publication that would focus on new releases and give local authors a platform, because there is no platform when you have a pandemic and no book events, no book tour. Do you remember the old days when you'd go on your book tour and they'd pick you up at the airport? I know. Okay, let me rub in the salt. They pick you up at the airport and they take you to a nice restaurant and then you'd have a crowd and it would be fabulous. So Sandra, how are you navigating the pandemic book tour?
Well, here's my book tour. You see the messy living room. This is what we're doing. I mean, I think my book officially came out June 2nd. So, originally it was, and this, the national emergency was declared on March 13th, Friday. So those of us were going, well, I'm sorry that you have your book coming out in March and April and May, but surely by, and then one by one, of course, things get canceled or pivoted to a virtual event. So, so that first of all, it became about like my personal kind of, struggle. And then it became kind of, my book actually came out June 2nd on Blackout Tuesday. So obviously it's kind of like, I could focus on my problems, but that would really be horrific because there's much bigger questions afoot. So of course we postponed and canceled things that were happening then. But I think to a certain extent, because my book, The Mad Woman in the Roomba, it's very much a domestic comedy. When I was writing it in 2015, 16, 17, 18, I actually turned it in 2 years late because I was so traumatized by the election as a kind of menopausal 50-something Democrat female of where I was just, how can we go forward? And so I had some material in that book that my editor said, you know, you better take it out because by the time this thing comes out in 2020, which seems so futuristic, people are not going to be fixated on how to knit a pussy hat exactly. They will have mastered it by then, Sandra. So I put a thing in the preface of saying, you know, and to a certain extent, when Bette Midler does her shows, and she's always Dolores Delago, you know, the mermaid in the wheelchair, like reading a newspaper and going, well, the news is awful. And it always is. Now, it's particularly surreal in these particular times, but I think still we're finding amidst this whole national conversation, a place where there can be moments of personal moments of even humor for a moment temporarily before we go back to, you know, the questions at large. And I think, you know, it was ironic because already a few months before when the quarantine had come down, people were already just really exhausted and in their heads, and summer was coming. They just, I want to have a beer outside. Yeah. I'm going to lie in a hammock. I'm going to read a funny book, maybe with travel in it. And the couple of books that we're going to be talking about today happen to have incredible journeys of travel and sweep to them. So that's kind of what we're talking about this summer of the joy of reading, regardless of where you're doing it. I mean, and I also want to add just like the one quick thing that I found instead of the fantastic bookstore events, since we can't do autographing books at bookstores, I started doing what I call this COVID-safe curbside pickup of autographed books out of my garage.
And goddess pants,
goddess pants, which you're wearing, which are these that I give to my people who come because you know, I haven't gotten fat. I've become more goddessy. It's a stretch elastic waistband. So I give these out, and I give these lighters that are based on my dad. It's in the book. And it's been really fun because I think we have slowed down time so much where it isn't a throng of people in the bookstore. It may be one person or two people, and we sit safely on folding chairs, and we really just get to visit because we're not supposed to be in crowds, which is good for a mid-list author, where I go, it's not that 1,000 people wouldn't show up, it's just that we're being COVID safe. So to a certain extent, I think it's possible, even in this time with all this, you know, in this fraught moment, that we can still make personal-to-person connections, especially on books and authors to our readers. Which is why we're here today, aren't we, Samantha?
Yes. Great segue.
Yes. And on that note, we pivot. It's like in the Great British Baking Show where you go, bye-bye, Samantha. So we're going to say bye-bye. Samantha will be back at the end of the hour to visit with us again. And so I'm going to pivot now to our first author, the fantastic Maggie Downs. Now, Maggie, who is in Palm Springs, as you say, your caftan. So your caftan, because it's Palm Springs. I'm going to do what I call the 30-second download, just so people can meet you. And as I like to say, we usually don't mention all the tons of awards that people have won because that would take too long. So we just kind of will name titles and books, and you can research more fully the Wikipedias later. So here we go, 30 seconds. Maggie Downs has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, McSweeney's, and last but not least, Palm Springs Life, as you live in Palm Springs, with your 5-year-old son, who has a fantastic name of Everest, which we'll talk about more. Maggie has been anthologized into name just 2, the Lonely Planet Travel Anthology and Best Women's Travel Writing. Her wonderful first book, a memoir called Braver Than You Think, tells the story of Maggie, who you see in her box, at age 34, newly married, an award-winning journalist. She quits her job, sells everything, and goes on the solo trip of a lifetime. Whose trip? Her mother's. We'll hear about that more in a minute. So welcome, Maggie. That's your intro. Yeah. So I wonder if you could start with the title, Braver Than You Think, and go from there. Tell us the story of your book.
Yeah, so So I traveled around the world, making the trip that my mom couldn't take herself because she was in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease. So she didn't have an official bucket list, but she had things that she wanted to do and things that I pulled from memories, places that she talked about, or goals that she had. She wanted to go on a safari or see the pyramids and things that I think a lot of people want to do. So I did set off on this journey on a very bare bones budget of $10,000 for a year. And a journey like that comes with some difficulty. It's not all a resort in Cabo or something. It comes with some really stressful moments, and it comes with trouble. And there were times that I slept at bus stations, or I was attacked by a monkey. I was in Egypt during the Arab Spring. Like, all of these things happened. And when those moments happened, as a solo traveler, I thought back to when I was a little girl. My mom would say, "You are braver than you think you are." And that was just the little boost I needed as a girl who was kind of bullied in school or never felt like I fit in. That helped get me through the day. So it became kind of a mantra as I was traveling, like, okay, you are braver than you think. And so the book, as I originally wrote it, had a different title, but then my editor was like, you have to call it Braver Than You Think, because that was something that, brought you so much strength during this trip. And as soon as he said it, it was like everything clicked into place.
Yeah, and I think that, it is that your mother got Alzheimer's pretty early. Actually, mine did too. Mine did at 59, which was a long time ago. And weathering that journey, it's so full of grief, but you're also really funny. So how do you manage to negotiate that voyage of grief with moments of light? And if you say, even in the darkest moment, there are pancakes.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Is that your philosophy,
right.
or the way you write, or what you thought the book needed to have?
I think the book needed to have that. And as my mom had Alzheimer's for 10 years before she died. And during that time, I found it really difficult to read books about Alzheimer's because it's such a grim disease. There's no light at the end of that tunnel. And I felt like I was already living through so much hardship with being a caregiver and seeing my mom, in watching her decline, that like I didn't want a book that was just completely steeped in grief. And I feel like life isn't steeped in grief all the time anyway. There are moments of lightness, there are moments of joy. And so I really tried to balance it out. And I mean, really weird, funny things happen when you're traveling anyway. So that was really easy to pull into that.
So, and I know being attacked by the monkey is one, but is there kind of another moment of lightness or unexpected comedy that you might share for the listeners that happens in your book along the way?
Well, so I was in Thailand during a festival called Songkran, and it's the water festival. And people, for about 3 or 4 days, people just have a massive water balloon fight, and they bring out like squirt guns, and there was a moment where a monk shoots me in the face with water from a water gun. So that's the first thing that popped into my mind. But there are just so many. I think the world is just rich with humor if you start to look for it. So hopefully that's threaded in my book.
Yeah, which is a great read. And of course, you also this is new releases. And so this is your very first book, and whoa, the timing. So right. What's that been like for you?
Yeah, as Sam was saying earlier, like the book tour, I kind of envisioned myself like with hat boxes and going to different cities, like on a train, and very glamorous, and that hasn't happened. Like I've been in this condo since March 13th. And it almost feels like the book isn't real, because I had these certain things, these like rites of passage, even if it's standing in front of an empty Barnes and Noble. I had these things that all writers talk about, that I kind of wanted that experience. I haven't had that. I haven't had the experience of, seeing my book in an airport, bookshop, or just seeing it in a window or seeing somebody reading it. I have, the pandemic has forced us all to be really creative. So I have done some curbside signings for people. I signed up for stamps.com so that I could send out copies, like signed copies to people and just have them Venmo me. And then some of my friends they managed to do a book release party for me, which I didn't think would be possible, but they found an empty resort, and right now Palm Springs is full of them. And they managed to secure an empty resort. They had cookies made with my book cover, and we had champagne, and we distanced with like all of us at separate ends of the pool. And we just, had champagne in the pool and ate cookies, and I signed my books for them. And, I kind of love having an empty resort all to myself. So that was, that was a definite highlight of this.
Oh yeah. And it's kind of, the odd thing that we might look back on some of this and miss some of this. We don't
Right.
And you also have been, I have one actually writerly question for you, but before pivoting there, and you've been homeschooling your son at 5 also.
I have been homeschooling my son. And, that has been difficult to squeeze into, trying to do the book launch from home. I've started doing a lot of online events, and I pivoted to doing a lot of virtual book clubs. So I've done about 24 virtual book clubs in the past month, which is, an intense schedule of visiting book clubs, but it's been really great. And so I'm like trying to keep my son occupied while I'm talking to book clubs around the world. And, and it's like living with Captain Underpants, because he's 5, he's always naked, he's always talking about toilets and butts, and he always has a dish towel, clipped around his neck, and he's like running through the house as a superhero. And, he's ended up on quite a few Zoom events, so you might want to look out for him.
That have all been recorded, as
right,
we
yeah.
know in this time. He'll never live that down. He'll enjoy seeing that on the therapist's couch later. So, and when we were visiting a little bit before, you have a connection with our next guest, Hector Tobar, that you'd met before. Can you relate to the viewers what that was?
Yeah. I'm so excited to share this. I was really excited to see that Hector was a part of this. So I received my MFA from the University of California, Riverside, Palm Desert. We have a low residency MFA. And Hector came to our residency, and it was when I was in the process of writing this book. And he gave a lecture about using the elements of fiction to tell nonfiction stories. And it's when he was writing his book about the trapped Chilean miners. And so he talked a lot about the narrative structure of fiction and how that can create drama, and how you can create characters out of real people, and just bringing in color so that it makes a nonfiction story so much more readable, like very page-turny, and his talk really stuck with me, and it meant a lot as I was writing my book. So I'm just thrilled to be on the same Zoom call with him.
Yes. I thought that was so interesting, and sort of the nonfiction and fictional elements working together is kind of very much kind of what his new book deals with in an interesting way. And lastly, before we let you go, it's been so short, the time flies, and I think there are many viewers, and we got a question regarding this, and saying more generally, if you have any words of advice to a first-time writer, maybe somebody who doesn't even have the credits that you have, but they have a memoir or a story to tell, either inspirationally or a little bit practically, how they might even get that manuscript to an agent or publisher, or just any words of advice you have for a new writer.
Yeah. So I worked pretty closely toward the end of my book with a writer named Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, and they always say that memoir is the genre of discovery. And so you don't even know what the story is until you're like mucking around in the darkness, you know, until you start telling it, you don't even really know what your story is. And that's what I found was true with my memoir. I started to write it as a straight adventure story, and only, you know, years into it, I discovered that the heartbeat of the story was my mom, who motivated me to take this trip. And that's when the story became so much fuller and more resonant. And so I think it's just, you just have to get into it and discover what your story is. And until you find that, it's not going to resonate with an agent. It's not going to find its home. It's not going to be the story that it needs to be.
And I'm so glad that you told about that process, because when we begin with the title, Braver Than You Think the first thing is the title. And that's, and when you're saying actually that title came later, and that adventure of finding the heart of the story came in the process. I think that's really helpful for writers to learn.
Yeah, I read a book about radio storytelling, and Ira Glass, he calls that moment like the German forest, when you are the German forest is a place that's dark and it's dense and it's hard to find your way out. Like there's no path. You don't know which way to go home. And I think that's where you need to take yourself in the story, is into the German forest. And only then can you start to find your path.
Maggie Downs, ladies and gentlemen, like a first-time book author. What a pleasure to talk to you so much.
Thank you so much.
And the book is Braver Than You Think, and it's a must-buy because you'll go so many places in it. You can sit on your hammock and travel safely, COVID safely, and it's a terrific book, so congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up, our next guest is Mr. Hector Tobar. Welcome, Hector. And I'll do your 30-second download for those who went and updating. And as I say, while we don't tend to list all of our prizes that our authors have won, somehow I have to say, Hector Tobar is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who's written for the New York Times, New Yorker, and the LA Times, also an acclaimed fiction writer, so the journalism and the fiction. Hector's work has appeared in the Best American Short Stories, LA Noir, Ziziva, and Slate. His books are The Barbarian Nurseries, Translation Nation, The Tattooed Soldier. His New York Times bestseller that Maggie mentioned, Deep Down Dark, was the story about the 2010 Chilean mine collapse, trapping 33 men, half a mile underground for 69 days. And so they made a pact. If they survived, they'd only share their story collectively, so no one would profit. As the 33, who did they choose to tell their story? Hector Tobar. It was also made into a movie starring Antonio Banderas, but we don't have enough 4 hours for me to fangirl about that. Welcome, Hector.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandra, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to everyone who organized this wonderful event.
Yeah, and I wonder if do you remember Maggie and the UC Riverside, talking to writers and about?
Oh, absolutely. I thought, man, what a great gig. You know, they have this low-res MFA, and they meet out in a resort in the desert. You know, it happens to be in the middle of summer, but still, it's a resort. So it's a wonderful program led by an old friend, Todd Goldberg.
Yes. Fantastic. Now, before we pivot to your fascinating new novel, we were talking a little bit. I mean, today is Juneteenth, which is, the oldest commemoration of the ending of slavery. So, racial things, uprisings are on people's minds. And, your Pulitzer Prize winning LA Times coverage was on the 1992 Rodney King uprisings. And you are the son of Guatemalan immigrants, native of Los Angeles. So you've seen quite a few street events. And you recently wrote just this great essay, widely read in Lit Hub, about your thoughts about this kind of the protests in the last few weeks. Could you just share a little bit about that? It's very interesting.
Yeah, we've been locked, my family and I, we've been locked here at home like everyone else. And we've been learning how to live through the pandemic and really becoming closer as a family, I'd have to say. My 3 kids are from 16 on up. My oldest is 23. And so, we're the kids are bigger and we don't really always eat together anymore. But now, since the pandemic, every night we have dinner together. And so that has been a wonderful experience. And then in the middle of this, we're also seeing the horrible toll it's taken on New York and other cities of the world. But then we see on the television this, revolution breaking out, this spontaneous explosion of anger and idealism, I have to say also, spurned by this horrible event that took place in Minneapolis. And then one morning, turn on the television and we see their demonstrations in Los Angeles, and the city is burning again. And I had a couple of hours of just flashbacks. I saw those first fires on Fairfax, and I told my kids, this could spread. This could really spread, because that's what happened in 1992. I was in the newsroom of the LA Times, and we watched this begin in flashpoints like Florence and Normandy, and it consumed the entire city, and it became this, this massive sociological, political event of African-American anger and Latino frustration. And so to see that, playing again in our television screens, but the outcome has been really different, because in Los Angeles in 1992, a huge part of the city was destroyed. And here in 2020, we have this, growing consciousness, this incredible movement where, the white middle class has suddenly woken up to this, this phenomenon that has been going on throughout American history. And here in Los Angeles, really since its founding, many books have been written about the violence in Los Angeles and the racially tinged and ethnically tinged violence in Los Angeles. And suddenly, I have my middle-class neighbors, white middle-class neighbors with Black Lives Matter signs on their houses. One spray painted Black Lives Matter in white paint on their asphalt driveway. My neighbor next door, who's from Wisconsin, very nice woman, also white woman. She has a Black Panther black fist on her on her garage. So it's been a really interesting, really interesting experience. To see this unfold, to see the movement of history and see the evolution of history in this time.
And I think it's interesting because your work kind of often deals with two cultures coming together, or the intersection of when different cultural or ethnic groups come together, which in a way kind of leads us to your book in a certain way, doesn't it? Which is just a fantastic, when you like The Last Great Road Bum, which is about, when you're talking about the Midwest, which is the hero is from Urbana, Illinois. Right. So it's like that Midwest, that continue, and like just, and he's the hero of the story. So it's such a fascinating book. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your evolution to write this novel that's just coming out?
Well, yeah, one of my last assignments as a reporter for the LA Times was that I was the Mexico City bureau chief. And as part of that job, I covered El Salvador and Central America. And I had a fixer researcher in San Salvador who one day told me about the existence of a diary that had been left behind by the only American to have died in battle fighting with the Salvadoran guerrillas in the 1980s Civil War. And so Joe Sanderson of Urbana, Illinois, son of an entomology professor, a man who specialized in June beetles, believe it or not. This young man had spent 20 years hitchhiking around the world. We're talking about travel, and Maggie's book had talked a lot about travel. He had spent 20 years hitchhiking around the world, 70 different countries, and his adventures end when he's 38, 39 years old in El Salvador, and he joins up with this rebel group. And so I got a copy of his diary from the rebels who had kept this document for more than 20 years, was able to look through this diary that he kept, and he died in battle. And so it goes right up to the morning before he was killed. I contacted his family, and I found out that he had been writing to his mother for the 20 years old he was on the road. And so my novel is based on this diary, his war diary that he had on his back when he was killed, and also on the 20 years of letters that were saved by his mother and that were lovingly preserved by his brother in these plastic boxes in Urbana. And so I decided that I would write a novel about Joe, because Joe did all these crazy things. He was a road bum traveling the world, joined the guerrillas, actually went also to Nigeria during the Civil War in the 1960s and worked for the Red Cross. and he did many, many other, borderline sort of, risky things to write novels. He wanted to write novels, but he was a terrible writer. He didn't believe in revision, which of course is the one thing that all of us, we learn that we suffer through is revision. And Joe didn't revise. And so I decided, wow, instead of writing a nonfiction book about this guy, maybe I should write a novel. I should write his novel. And so I spent the last 3-4 years of my life becoming Joe Sanderson and writing the novel about his life and work.
So becoming him. So in that part that you had to fill in as a novel writer, you didn't say, and this is where Hector gets to say, be him, but so you're saying you really tried to become him, to become that person.
Well, absolutely. I mean, he grew up in the 1950s and 1960s as a young man in a country, yes, markedly different from the Los Angeles of the 70s and 80s that I grew up in, but still an American boy. We American boys are taught that the world belongs to us in one way or another, and Joe really, really took that to heart. And yeah, it was a big challenge to enter into that perspective. But Joe started off collecting butterflies. I knew this from his father, who I interviewed before he died. Milt Sanderson died at 101 years old. I interviewed him when he was 100 years old.
Oh
and he
gosh.
told me all these stories about Joe growing up. And he told me that Joe was a great butterfly collector, and that his butterflies were still stored in the Natural History Museum at the University of Illinois. And so I went there, I looked up, and I found his butterflies. And so that's how my novel begins, is with Joe collecting butterflies. And so becoming this boy who later is completely radicalized by his travels. Joe was a Republican in the 1960s. He voted for Richard Nixon, in that first against John F. Kennedy in 1960 election. He goes to joining a group of Marxist rebels when he's in his late 30s. And so he had an incredible trajectory, as we say in Spanish, of just his evolution as a person. And that's a lot of what the novel's about.
And I mean, it seems there's, the 33 Chilean miners, they picked, of all people, you to tell your story. These diaries were saved for a while, and then they let you look at them. So you're kind of like the story whisperer. What is it about you that makes people go, I'm going to let Hector Tobar tell my story? What do you think there's a technique that you have, or it's just you, or?
Well, it's funny you say that, because when I teach at UC Irvine, that's what I tell my students. I tell them, come to my office hours with your story idea, because I'm the story whisperer. I'll help you fix your story and get it going, because I'll just sort of listen and feel the story and, feel its pulse. And I'll tell you, you need to do that. What about if you did this? And it's I think it just comes from, well, actually having worked in a newsroom, just the repetition of churning out stories that are due at 5 p.m., which was our old deadline at the LA Times. You at a newspaper, you interview somebody at 10 o'clock in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, you drive back to the newsroom and you write up their story as quickly as you can. And so that practice as a reporter really honed my listening. I tell my students, when you interview somebody, think like a writer, look for those details, listen for the details. And most importantly, I think the most important thing is just to be curious and to be honest with people and to be sincerely interested in people. I think people can really tell. I've interviewed literally tens of thousands of people, and I firmly believe that someone can tell when you're a phony. Someone can tell when you're manipulating them. People are really intelligent, even people who are illiterate. And I've interviewed people who are really illiterate. People who are, have little education. Anyone can really sort of tell your sincerity. And so I think it's really good to be, I think you just need to be interested in people. It helps that I'm an only child of divorced parents, but that's another story.
So, well, it's interesting. So those are the journalistic techniques of getting
Right.
that story at 5 p.m. so that even in talking to people, you have a structure in your mind. But
Right.
when you were talking at UC Riverside, you were talking about using elements of fiction writing to inform a non-narrative piece. I mean, Maggie talked about the German forest, the dark German forest. When you write, is there a dark German forest that you're going to, or do you feel like you pretty much are able to navigate and negotiate the book? Is there any time that you get lost, I'm going to get lost?
Oh, absolutely. I get lost all the time. I think one of the great secrets of a great book almost is that how much you've cut from it. And so this is a book that when I wrote my first draft was probably 170,000 words long. And the version that is being published by MCD FSG is 120,000. So I cut 50,000 words. I cut probably a year of work out of my manuscript. So I spent a year spinning my wheels. And so I think, and Maggie said this also, the way you just find the subject, and so spinning my wheels, trying to become Joe, going off on many adventures. I had to reduce, his girlfriends by half. My editor told me there's too many girlfriends in this, there's too many women coming in and out, and they all actually kind of are the same, which actually speaks more to me than to Joe, but, and so, just being really disciplined in that way. But also just realizing after doing all this spinning your wheels, what the story really is. And towards the end, I realized that this was really a book about Joe and his mother, because Joe always wrote letters to his mother. And his mother was a Republican. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Through another member of the DAR that I met at a hotel in Pennsylvania when I was on my own road trip with my son, I was able to actually trace the exact revolutionary soldier to whom Joe and his mother traced their ancestry to become part of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so, he really loved this woman, even though she was so frustrated with him. From the time that he dropped out of college to the time that he died, Joe, when are you going to find yourself? When are you going to get off the road and get a real job, And so this relationship is really one of the anchors of this book. It's really about a young man traveling the world so that he can tell stories that impress his mother.
Oh my gosh, that's also an interesting connection with Maggie's book. One final quick question. I wish we could talk for another, okay. Sandra Dobras, it's a quick question for you. Your scarf, is that a keffiyeh as a scarf? Do you have an Arabic connection? Can you speak to that? Like, everybody's very interested in what you're wearing.
Yes, this is a keffiyeh, and I bought it when I was an LA Times correspondent covering the first years of the Iraq War, the second one, in 2002, I believe it was. Yes, 2002, 2003. I was in Baghdad for a few weeks, and I bought this keffiyeh, and it just so happens that Joe Sanderson also traveled through Baghdad. So I was able to sort of, use some of my memories of the sunflower fields of Iraq and other places in the Middle East and put those into the story. I mean, Joe did so many things. He hitchhiked across Iraq and Syria and Iran and Afghanistan, something you could never do today, and just had so many great adventures. So the keffiyeh is also kind of a memory of Joe.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure visiting. Hector Tobar, the new book is The Last Great Road Bum, incredible novel. You must get it. And it's coming out in August, is it?
Yes, August 25th.
So August 25th, so you can pre-order now. Do it. All right. Thank you, Hector. And finally, last but not least, we turn to our final guest, a personal favorite of mine. I've known her work for so many years, the great Charlene Woodard. Welcome. You have your scarf too. So I'm going to do your 30-second download, which is, again, incomplete. And I am going to mention a couple of awards. I just have to. It just kind of flows that way. Okay. So I'll say, while super fans of Pose, like my teens, well, and myself, know Charlayne as the fabulous Helena St. Rogers, Pose's legendary dance teacher and star maker. Aside from her copious movie work, Charlayne has starred on Broadway in the original company of Ain't Misbehavin', that's Tony and Drama Desk nominations. Off-Broadway, two-time OB Award winner, starred in the plays of John Robbie Bates, Athol Fugard, and Lynn Nottage. But Charlayne is here today because of her acclaimed solo plays, which are Pretty Fire, Neat, In Real Life, and The Night Watcher. What I kind of relate to also as a performer, which I thought would be a great conversation, is here's a brilliant performer who's also a brilliant writer. Like Pretty Fire won NAACP Theater Awards for Best Play and Best Playwright, and it's a solo play. So I want to talk about that today. Welcome, Charlayne.
Thank you very much, Sandra.
It's so great to see you. And so sometimes what we get to do on our Evolving show is we talk about new releases, but also we get to go back in time sometimes and look at pieces that remain really relevant even today. And you know, I love all your pieces, but a personal favorite is your first one, Pretty Fire, because that's the first one I saw. And that was, I think, it premiered at the Fountainhead Theater in Los Angeles in 1992.
Yes, it did.
Yes, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the evolution of writing that piece.
Well, I had just spent, because of Ain't Misbehavin', I spent 15 years in New York City doing musicals, and only musicals. And of course, I went to drama school, and I meant to do, work in straight plays, which is a whole lot easier than a musical. Singing 8 shows a week, and my training was not for that. So it was a challenge. And I remember Andre DeShields told me, you're going to do these musicals until you learn how to do them. So 15 years later, I felt like I had learned how to do it. I moved to LA expecting to live up on a hill and get a sitcom really quickly or get a TV show or something without singing. And then I started doing the auditions and everything. I realized I was working on characters who were supposed to be Black characters, but they didn't speak to me. And I said, my goodness, at an audition one day, a lot of sisters all went to coffee after to complain. And I was reading Maya Angelou's book at the time, Wouldn't Say Nothing for My Journey Now. And she said, if you don't like something, fix it. And if you can't fix it, change the way you think about it, but stop complaining. So I realized I had to, if someone was going to write about me, I had to do it. I can't expect someone to know about me unless I let them know about me. So, a lot of magic happened that allowed me to write that first play. My grandmother died, and I wanted to, I wanted to go to this retreat because I was really grieving. And my pastor's wife, I was new to this big, wonderful church, West Angeles Church of God in Christ. My pastor's wife asked me if I could sing for about half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour, on the first night of the retreat. Well, on the first night of the retreat, there were 450 women there in a ballroom with circular tables. And I decided that I would not sing, but to write a story about my grandmother and how she made me perform, tricked me into it. But I told that story, and 450 women told me after that personal story was their story. So I immediately said, I'm going to add four more stories and create a night of theater, because I had no idea that would be a night of theater. But because I could see them all, because we could relate, because it was like antiphonal response, because that audience was my scene partner, it was alive as any play I'd ever done. And I came running after that feeling for, I guess ever since then.
Well, and I think that I listened to it again this morning on the audiobook. Your performance is great. And it's interesting. It's really such a really rich piece. It's about growing up as a little girl, in Albany, New York, and then visiting your grandparents in the South, and just loving that Dixie song, not really like of little girls watching the TV and like going, what do you want? And your mom goes, what do you want to be when you grow up? What? And you said, Lassie.
Yeah.
Right.
Because when I grew up, we had no role models. Right. No Black role models. But I loved Lassie. And I loved Shirley Temple. And I said, I want to be Shirley Temple. I want to be Lassie. My sister wanted to be a maid because in all the movies we saw, they all wore clean clothes, starched aprons and clean clothes,
Right. And it's interesting because it's such a very masterfully written piece. Okay. And that's what I want to, because it, as you said, it's in the voice of the little girl. So to me, it reminds me a little bit in a certain way of Angela's Ashes, the Frank McCourt novel, because he worked for 10 to 15 years to find the voice of that, because these terrible things happen in Ireland. And if you told it from an adult's point of view, to go, oh no, oh no, oh no, and the kids see it as it's happening, you know, and as the pretty fire of the title of that. I mean, it's like your character thinks it's pretty, but it's not.
Yes, it's a play seen. The story is told through the eyes of a little girl, and it shows at point a lot of the way how quickly we lose our innocence in this country. You know, that pretty fire was. I mean, spoiler, y'all, but we did not know that looking from my grandmother's window in Savannah, Georgia, but at the bottom of her Black community, that the cross that was burning there was meant for intimidation. We thought the cross burning there was the most beautiful Jesus Christ cross in the world. It was on fire, and it was lovely.
Yeah, and that is, and then you sing the Dixieland song after that. It is really, I think I really.
We thought we loved Dixie. We loved that song. It meant the South. And you know, when my sister Allie and I were, 4, 5, 6, this is what it was. It was summers down in Savannah, and lots of seafood, and lots of walking barefoot in red clay roads and things like that.
And I think. It's fascinating because it takes you so many different places. And I think, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about it, one of the most powerful, and I'm getting a little choked up thinking about it, one of the most powerful stories in there. And it hits you only when you think, and I think years later, people would always say, what of your piece is that story in? And that's the story of when you're a little girl in school and you are, because you're so smart, you're transferred to the smart kids school where there are a lot of white kids. But I think,
yeah, in a class of 16, there were 2 Black students.
But when you're telling it as a little girl, you're going, well, you don't really make much of it when you go through, oh, I just have to do to another bus stop, and then it's this, and then I like that, and then we ran.
And then I made friends, and it's like, and I talk about making friends with these girls that, I mean, we were the 3 Musketeers, Barbara and Linda and myself. And then, of course, one day, and not the first year because we're really young, but one day, you know, Barbara just woke up and looked at me and saw me differently and called me the N-word. And in front of the entire class. And I could tell right away, even though that name was not anything I'd ever heard hurled at me, I knew it was horrible. And of course, the teacher snatched her up and took her off into the schoolroom. But when I went home to tell my mother, oh, I was devastated. I came in, I was screaming, you know, Mommy, and telling her that she did this. And it was a betrayal, you know, and everything, because I thought she was my friend. But it's just something that she learned, and she said so. She said, my father said, and there it was. And my mother is an extraordinary woman to this day, because she got me ready. She knew that from 3rd grade to 12th, I would be outnumbered. I would be hanging out with the dominant culture. And so she would, every week I came home with something happened between a teacher or a student. And nobody really realized a lot of times people didn't know that they had hurt me. But Mommy would just dust that stuff right off of you and give you a reason not to be hurt, strengthen you, and send you back out. She said to me that day, when I told her that Barbara called me that N-word, she was in the garden, in the backyard, at the peach tree. She put down her tools, took off her gloves, threw her head back, and laughed. And I begged her, Mommy, please stop it. I'm very serious. You know, here I am in 4th grade begging her to be serious. And she looked around the yard. She said, okay, Charlayne, what if I were to call you a rabbit pellet? Okay, that's crazy, Mom. Okay, what if I were to call you a stinkweed? Come on, hey, come on over here, rabbit pellet, and give Mama some sugar. I mean, she was like that. And then I got it, and I called her like a froggy face, and we started throwing names. And next thing you know, we're running around this peach tree and calling names and laughing. She had me laughing about this moment that she knew I'd have to live through over and over and over again. And she told me in that grass underneath that peach tree that word is a word that people purposely made up to sling at us whenever they want to stop us, whenever they want us to not reach the goal we're trying to reach. They do that on purpose. But I want you, when they do that, she said, I want you to laugh to yourself. How silly are they? Because we all know that you're not a stinkweed, you're not a rabbit pellet, and you are not, will never be their N-word. And
I think that's so powerful, and it's so surprising that your mother, that moment that your mother laughs is just like, it's shocking, but it's amazing, and it's like transformative. But I think that there's something that's so interesting about that story, because you mentioned that you did it at another time in New York, and an older Jewish man came up to you.
Yeah, I'm at Manhattan Theater Club doing this play. They did, Manhattan Theater Club, God bless them, did three of my first three solo plays, the first ones. And after the show in the lobby, there was a man, a Jewish man in a wheelchair waiting for me a half an hour after the show ended, waiting to tell me that that he had a personal connection to my story, because that's what happened to him. That's not that word. He had the K word thrown at him. And he felt exactly the way I felt, and that he wished his mother had handled it the way mine did.
Yes, that's so powerful. And and it's interesting with this kind of story, this kind of solo piece that's so beautifully written, so universally written. I think everyone has some version of your grandmother, maybe not as awesome, like a really, on my deathbed, I would like somebody to sing in the choir. And it is so relatable. And I remember when I was doing my show, Aliens in America. So you were touring all over the country doing your show. And then very occasionally, if you were double or triple booked at the end of the season, they say, who can we get aside from Charlayne? And then I went into your one slot early on. In Seattle. And my piece was Aliens in America, about my Chinese father and German mother, who has that kind of background? But I think in some other way, I would have people come up to me and go, oh, that's my story. Peruvian and Guatemalan, they didn't like each other, or they were from the same town, but wrong parts of the town. So I think there's something very interesting about these
There's something very universal about the personal.
Yes. You know
what I mean?
Yes.
That's all. It just shows the connection between all of us. And that's why I write to tell our stories. I don't think enough of our stories have been told. We've only just started telling our stories. I'm from the oral tradition, and we, in general, all these centuries, have been a part of that oral tradition.
Yeah, it's really incredible. It's incredibly moving about stories that connect us when the news, as it's in 24/7, can sometimes be so just divisive and splitting us into different parties and names and things. But I think that simple human story of somebody telling their childhood, it's so relatable.
And I like telling mine through the eyes of a child, because if I were to tell these stories about race and culture, and if I tell these stories as the grown-up, then sometimes people are like, I don't want to hear that. I mean, what I love is people are ready to hear those stories now. But, back in 1992 or even before, it's like, I don't want to go there. I don't know where she's going to take me, But I love that now people are pretty good at listening and hearing what you have to say. But then I chose to tell it through a child, because everybody lets down their guard with a little girl.
And on that note, oh my gosh, Charlene Woodard, thank you so much for coming. You are amazing. You are just amazing, just mind-blowing and amazing.
Thanks for having me.
As always, brilliant playwright, writer, and performer. I'm going to dry my tears now. Samantha, back to you.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Charlayne. This was an amazing night. I hope all of you enjoyed it as much as I did. I just want to say, man, I just keep saying thank you. This was just incredible. Next week, I hope you'll join us again. We have, as our topic, adaptation, moving from the page to the screen or the stage. And our guests next week will be W. Bruce Cameron and Catherine Michon and Janelle Brown. And that's it. Please join us next week.